Hi, everybody. Tonight, let me tell you the story of a soul reborn in a time of ice and iron. This is the life you once lived, the life of a Viking berserker. You were not merely a warrior, but a creature of storm and flame, shunned and revered in equal measure. Your tale begins not in bloodshed, but in silence, a quiet village nestled between the fjords of the north, where the sea sighs against the stones and ravens watch from the pines. Over 20 long chapters, we'll follow your journey from a boy of no name to a legend spoken of in hushed tones around winter fires. This is a tale of rage and tenderness, of exile and homecoming, and of finding your truest self in the echoing stillness after the battle is done. So let us begin, gently, at the very beginning. The village of Havengrimmer had no walls, only a scattering of longhouses that curled like smoke up the slope from the Blackstone shore. It was not marked on any maps, for none were needed. All paths to Havengrimmer were known only to those born with salt in their veins and ash beneath their fingernails. And you, though still a boy in that first winter of remembrance, were one of them. The sea was the first thing you ever heard and the last thing you would ever fear. Your mother, Ilsa, was a weaver of sealskin and song. She sang not just to lull you to sleep, but to wake the sun when it slept too long behind the snow clouds. Her hands smelled always of the sea, not the clean brine of the open waves, but the deeper, older scent of tide pools and wrack, of secrets kept in kelp forests and whispered into driftwood. She braided your hair with bones of small animals and fed you cod so fresh it still twitched. Your father, Narbjorn, was spoken of more than seen. He returned each spring like the meltwater, bringing furs, carved bone trinkets, and tales, always tales, of strange lands and stranger winds. He would look at you as though you were both a memory and a puzzle, and then clap your shoulder so hard your knees would buckle. "You've your grandfather's eyes," he said once, when you were 5 and had fallen face first into a snowbank trying to wrestle a goat. "That mad old bastard stared down a bear once, stared it down and called it brother." It was said with pride, though not quite comfort. No one told you then what it meant to carry the blood of a berserker. In the village, there were whispers about your lineage, but they were soft ones, spoken over fire and mead. The old ones remembered your grandfather, Arnvid, who had once roared through the shield wall at Jornfjord and come back soaked in blood and visions. They said he had the sight when the fury took him, that he'd scream the names of gods no one else knew. One day, he walked out across the frozen bay at dusk and was never seen again. It was winter when the change first stirred in you. You were 10. The sea had frozen in strange fractal shapes, like the runes carved on driftwood staves. The sky hung low and pale, a canvas waiting for something to be written across it. The other children played in the snow, but you stayed at the water's edge, watching the ice breathe. You began to feel something different in your bones, a heat, strange and persistent, not illness, not fever, but a thrumming under your ribs, like the heartbeat of something far older than you. At night, your dreams filled with wolves, not hunting you, nor fleeing, simply watching, waiting. You saw fire too, not as destruction, but as release. In one dream, you stood atop a cliff of burning stone while the sea below boiled, and you screamed, not in fear, but in joy. The elders noticed. Yilsa brought you to the temple of the veiled goddess under the hill, where priestesses brewed bitter tea and spoke to stones. One traced the shape of your hands with ash and frowned. "He listens to the blood," she murmured. Too soon. But no one could stop it. Your first rage came in spring. A visiting merchant struck your cousin with a staff over a spilled bundle of dried fish. Something inside you broke open, or perhaps it awakened. You do not remember the moment clearly, only the sensation of immense pressure released, like a dam splitting under floodwaters. You heard yourself scream, a sound you had never known you could make, and then there was heat and rushing and blood, the merchant's, the cousin's, your own, and then silence. You woke with your hands bruised and torn, curled around the haft of a broken oar. After that, nothing was the same. You were kept apart. Children were told to play elsewhere. Women whispered behind their hands. Narbjorn didn't look at you the same. Even Yilsa's lullabies grew quieter. But the village needed warriors, and the gods did not frown upon fury, only uncontrolled fury. So you were sent north to the house of Valund the Bear. He lived in solitude near the cliffs, where the eagles nested and the winds could strip a man to the bone. Volund had once been a berserker too. It was said he'd gnawed through iron shackles and danced naked into battle, painting his face with crushed berries and the blood of deer. Now he walked with a limp and spoke only when the words mattered. Volund did not train you to fight. He trained you to know. You learned the names of trees and the songs of ice. You slept in snow to feel its breath and fasted for days to hear your heartbeat without fear. He told you of the hunger that lived beneath rage, the root from which the fury bloomed. It is not madness, he said once, though it will be if you feed it wrong. It is memory, ancient memory. You were never just one boy. You were all the wolves that ever howled. Years passed like this. Your body changed, not just with age, but with knowing. You became taller, broader, your steps quieter than any beast. You could stand still for hours, then burst into motion like lightning through dry grass. Your eyes turned darker, sharper, as if some old spirit had climbed behind them. And one day, Volund said you were ready, not for war, not for vengeance, but to walk among the world again with all that you carried. You descended the cliffs alone, and in the valley far below, the longships were gathering. Their sails were black as raven wings. You felt the pulse of the drums before you heard them, and your blood answered. The valley below Havengrim had changed. It had always been a quiet basin carved between mountains and mist, where flocks of sheep wandered and the grass grew in silvery waves. But now it quivered with tension, the kind that thickens the air and settles behind the ribs. Longships had come in the night, and with them, men and women of many clans. The ground no longer felt still. It vibrated faintly, like the breath of something stirring beneath the earth. You stood at the edge of it, high on a ridge, where the moss was cold and springy underfoot. From there, you could see the ships drawn ashore like beached serpents, their prows carved with snarling beasts and open-mouthed gods. The smell of tar, salt, and firewood reached even this far. You had not been among your kind in many seasons, yet the scene below pulled at some deep, dormant instinct. These were not strangers, not truly. They were the tribe behind the tribe, the kindred of old rage and rhythm. Still, you did not descend right away. Instead, you watched and listened. The drums had not yet begun, but the rhythm was already present. You saw it in the movements of warriors training in the frost-wet fields. You heard it in the cadence of voices raised in trade and argument, in the clang of axe against shield, and in the low chanting of a skald reciting the lineages of gods. It was not yet war, but it was no longer peace either. Eventually, your feet carried you forward, slowly, as though the earth remembered the weight of you and welcomed it back. They noticed you before you reached the boats. Some turned to look but did not speak. Their eyes traveled from your fur-lined cloak to your bare arms, crisscrossed with scars, some long faded, others fresh from the stone trials Volund had made you endure. Your presence was like wind through tall grass. It said something ancient, something inevitable. No one challenged you. You passed a woman stringing charms onto her spear shaft, bits of bone, feather, and worn antler. She nodded once, a shallow dip of respect, though her gaze did not leave your eyes. A child sitting by the fire took one look at you and shrank back behind his elder, wide-eyed and silent. You knew what they saw. You could feel it in the air around you. Volund had called it the shadow fire, the thing that burned behind your ribs, unseen but deeply sensed by those who had survived its touch. You walked until the ships rose tall beside you. Black sails furled like wings at rest. Shields painted with snarling wolves and curling sea dragons lined the rails. Beneath one of them, a familiar voice pierced the fog of memory. "Brynjar," she said. It struck like thunder, though soft in tone. You turned. Standing beneath the rising sun was someone you had not seen since the day you vanished into the high cliffs. Her face was different now, leaner, stronger, touched by command, but her voice had not changed. Not for you. Her name was Alfild. She had been your cousin once, or close enough. You had shared winter bread and berry wine under the same roof, had run through the pine woods barefoot and breathless. She had been the first to blood your lip and the first to make you laugh while it still bled. Even then, her fire had burned quietly, not like yours, but deep and steady, a forge rather than a storm. Now she wore mail over her shoulders, shaped to fit and scarred at the edges. Her hair was braided back with strands of fox fur and red thread. At her hip hung a sword you did not recognize. Its hilt was carved with a raven and 3 small dots, the mark of your great-grandfather's forge. Alfhild, you said, tasting the word as if unsure it would stay. Her eyes searched your face. So it's true then. You still live. You said nothing. There was no need. She stepped closer, boots crunching frost-bitten moss. They say you disappeared up into the cliff paths and never came back. Some said the wolves took you. Others said the sea did. But I said no. I said Brynjar would return. Only question was, which part of him? You looked past her toward the gathering host, the tent sprouting like mushrooms after rain. What is this? She followed your gaze. A call to vengeance. A blood feud grown too big for knives in the dark. It started small. A raid gone wrong, a chieftain's son slain, a winter storehouse burned. But it's turned now. Southlanders come with steel and coin, and someone has stirred the old clans. Havengrim will not be safe, nor any other village that cannot raise swords fast enough. You said, and they come here? They come to choose, she replied. Who among us is strong? Who among us is mad enough to lead? That stirred something. You turned your face to hers, and the old memory flickered. Of snow on your cheeks, of pine needles in your hair, of her voice calling your name while you ran through smoke. Alfhild studied you for a long moment more. Then, with something between a nod and a sigh, she said, There's a place for you here, if you want it. But don't come for glory, Brynjar. Come because you can't stay away. Then she turned and was gone. You stood alone again. But already the drums were beginning. The drums began low, a heartbeat beneath the breath of the earth. One slow thud, then another. Not rushed, not celebratory. This was not the rhythm of a festival or the wild beat of raiding. This was the sound of gathering, of summoning, of something weightier than celebration. It spoke to the bone, to the blood. The kind of sound that made old men sit up straighter and quiet children without a word. You stood at the edge of the gathering field, where the grass had been worn thin by boots and hoofprints. Smoke curled from a dozen fires, each belonging to a different clan. No banner flew, not yet. In the waiting silence between each drumbeat, voices spoke in low tones, discussing alliances, strategies, oaths remembered and oaths broken. Eyes wandered, measured, weighed. But when they passed over you, they often looked away. The shadow fire still clung to you. Alfhild had returned to her own, a circle of warriors bearing the white and red armband of House Skjarn. Their shields were freshly painted, their armor polished, but not new. They were seasoned, ready, and even they cast uncertain glances when you walked by. No one approached, no one asked your name. They didn't need to. Some part of them knew what you were, even if they couldn't speak it aloud. You passed a pair of young warriors sparring with wooden axes. Their rhythm was fluid, aggressive. The older of the two, a red-haired boy not yet past 20 winters, lunged too quickly and overextended. You watched the counterblow land square against his side. He crumpled, gasping but not broken. His companion offered a hand to help him rise. It stirred something in you, that simple moment, not the violence, but the pause, the reaching, the unspoken bond of combat without hatred. You had trained so long in silence, with snow and stone for company, that you'd almost forgotten what it was to be among others who moved with purpose. And yet, the itch beneath your skin remained, the sensation of barely leashed force, like thunder trapped behind your sternum. Valen had called it the iron wind, the storm that followed you always. Before long, a horn blew, sharp, long, twice. The gathering began. Men and women made their way toward the wide stone ring near the base of the fjord, where ancient trees stood watch and moss grew over forgotten carvings. This was where judgments were passed, where chieftains rose and fell, where alliances were sealed with blood. The old ways had not changed, not here, not yet. You moved with the crowd, but not among them. They let you pass, parting subtly, respectfully, not from friendship, but from recognition. Fear, perhaps, but not disdain. In the center of the circle stood a stone slab stained dark with age and history. Around it, the chosen speakers waited, not rulers, but voices. Elders from each clan, flanked by their best. You noticed Alfhild standing behind one such speaker, arms folded, face unreadable. She did not look your way. The first to speak was Hralfgar, a grizzled man whose left hand had been replaced with a carved hook of walrus bone. His voice was deep and scarred, like his body. We gather not for conquest, he said, but to decide if we still have the strength to endure. Murmurs rippled. He gestured to the horizon. Southlanders push from the coasts. Silver flows like rot into our roots. Men trade their axes for coin, their oaths for gold. If we do nothing, they will take our stories, then our land, then our names. Another elder spoke, a woman named Sigrun, her braids heavy with bone charms. We are not one people, not anymore. Our clans have drifted like icebergs. Some no longer remember the tongue of our fathers. She paused, but blood remembers. A third voice rang out, younger, clearer. It was Alfhild. She stepped forward without ceremony. We do not ask for unity, she said, only direction. Let those who still burn walk together. Let the rest stay behind and tend their fields. But if war is coming, we must walk toward it, not wait for it to find us. Her words settled over the crowd like falling snow, soft but certain. Then came the test. From the shadows of the circle stepped a man armored in blackened steel, his helm tucked under one arm. His beard was streaked with gray, but his shoulders were vast, and the scars across his chest told a tale older than his voice. I am Geir Skalson, he said, of the Broken Tooth Fjord. My clan stands ready, but I say no war leader should rise without proving he can bleed for us. He turned to the stone slab. Let any who would lead step forward and meet me in the old way. A murmur, then silence. Eyes darted. Warriors shifted. No one moved. And then, without meaning to, without even deciding, your feet did. You stepped into the ring. Geir's eyes narrowed. He did not recognize your face, but something in him recognized something deeper. Name yourself. You said it simply. Brynjar. He tilted his head. Clan? You said nothing. A flicker of confusion passed through him, then wariness, then something closer to respect. He nodded. The circle widened. The elders stepped back. There were no rules. Only one would still be standing. You reached for nothing. No weapon, no shield. The crowd noticed. Geir grunted. Bare hands then. And then he came at you. He was fast. Faster than you expected. A heavy-handed brawler who knew how to break ribs with a single swing. His fists came like hammers, and the first blow clipped your shoulder hard enough to numb your arm. You didn't strike back. Not yet. You waited. And when the second blow came, a vicious hook meant to take your head, you moved. Not away, but forward. Inside the swing, where the breath of his body could be felt, you caught him at the ribs with your elbow. A clean, savage strike. You heard something shift. He stumbled, then roared, and your vision blurred. The iron wind howled. For a moment, everything vanished, the circle, the crowd, the mountain beyond. There was only you and the blood and the need to move, to break, to end. But something held you, a whisper. Valen's voice, perhaps, or your own. Not madness, memory. You struck again, and then Geir was down. Not dead, but down. You stepped back, breath heaving, hands clenched, your heart pounding like the sea. The crowd was silent, and someone, you didn't see who, began to chant. Brynjar, then others, Brynjar. You stood in the center of the circle, the blood cooling on your skin, and for the first time in many seasons, you felt not fear, but belonging. The chanting faded slowly, like echoes down a fjord, giving way to the low hum of whispers and measured glances. You stood in the circle still, the last of your breath steaming in the morning chill. Blood darkened your knuckles. Geir Skalson had not risen, but neither had he been broken beyond healing. That too mattered. You had not let the storm consume you. From the shadows behind the stone slab, the elders stepped forward. Their faces revealed little, but their silence carried meaning. They had seen what needed to be seen. You were not crowned, not declared, not given a title with trumpet call or solemn rite. In the old way, to step into the ring and still stand was enough. You left the circle without ceremony. The crowd parted, some with reverence, others with unease. Alfhild met your eyes from across the field and gave you the smallest of nods. It was not approval, it was recognition. You were no longer the boy who had vanished into snow. You were something else now. Not exactly a leader, not yet, but the one they would watch, the one whose footsteps might determine the path ahead. That evening, the fires burned higher. Warriors sharpened their blades with more purpose. Small groups began to form, those who knew each other, those who sought common cause. Some gathered around clan standards, others around those with reputations built on old raids and scars. A few, cautious and quiet, kept glancing your way, though none approached directly. You sat alone by a driftwood fire, The flames crackled gently, and the smoke curled upward into the star-swept sky. Your hands rested on your knees, still sore from the fight. Around you, the night pressed close, thick with the scent of ash and pine and steel. Footsteps approached. You didn't look up. Not until she spoke. "I told them you'd come back different," Alfhild said, settling across from you. Her armor was loosened now, her sword sheathed. A half-finished piece of bread in her hand. She tore at it absently. "And do you think I did?" you asked, voice low. She studied you for a moment. "I think the cliff didn't kill you, and that says enough." You both sat in the quiet for a while. The fire between you popped and hissed, tiny embers rising like fireflies. Finally, she said, "They'll follow you now, some of them at least. Not because they know you or trust you, but because they saw you bleed and not fall. That's more than many have seen in years." You looked toward the black line of trees beyond the camp. "And where are they to follow me to?" She shrugged. "That's the question." You leaned back, letting the weight of the sky press into your shoulders. The stars were sharp, clear, as they always were in the north. You remembered names for them, names your mother once whispered while pointing with a driftwood stick. The wolf's jaw, the fire path, the broken shield. The sky never changed, even when everything else did. "You should speak with the seer," Alfhild said, her voice quiet. "She came down from the glacier pass 3 nights ago. No one summoned her. She just arrived." You glanced at her. "Is she one of ours?" "She's older than clans. They say she speaks with the drowned and the trees. Some say she's not truly alive." You raised an eyebrow. Alfhild half smiled. "That's what the old ones say anyway. She sits by the cliff's edge, near the place where the cold spring runs. If you go, go before dawn." With that, she rose and left you. The fire crackled on. You stayed awake that night, though your body longed for rest. You listened to the shifting wind, the occasional bark of laughter, the sigh of wolves somewhere beyond the tree line. And when the sky began to pale in the east, you stood and walked alone. The camp faded behind you, swallowed by mist and pine. You followed the sound of water. It wasn't a long walk, but it felt like one. The further you went, the quieter the world became. Even the birds fell silent. Frost kissed the edges of the stones, and the spring ran narrow and cold between moss-covered rocks. She was already waiting. Wrapped in a cloak of shadow wool and raven feathers, she sat cross-legged on a flat stone by the water's edge. Her hair was long and white, not with age alone, but with something older. Her eyes were closed, but you knew she saw you. You did not speak first. Eventually, her voice broke the hush. "You are the one who carries 2 names." You frowned. "I left the old name behind." "No," she said, her tone calm, distant. "You wear them both, one in your bones, the other in your breath. One born, one chosen. That is why the wolves followed you." You stepped closer. "Are you the seer?" She smiled faintly. "Names matter less to those who remember the sea before it had salt." You waited. She dipped her fingers into the spring and stirred it gently. "The blood that sings in you is not just from your line. It is older, wilder. The rage, the strength, the silence after, it is all memory. Your body is only its current home." You knelt slowly. "I don't understand what I'm meant to do." "No one does," she said. "That is not your task." "Then what is?" Her hand stilled. The water cleared. She gestured and you leaned forward. There, in the spring's reflection, you saw not yourself, but fire, distant cities, men with southern armor, ships burning in moonlight. You saw wolves running across snow, and a mountain split open by a scream. You saw a figure, tall, wrapped in a blood-red cloak, standing atop a field of ash. You could not see his face. You looked up sharply. But she was already standing, cloak billowing in a wind you could not feel. "You are not the end of this story," she said, turning away. "But you may decide where it begins." And just like that, she was gone. Only the water remained and the sky growing light. You walked back through the trees in silence, the seer's words still flickering behind your eyes like torchlight glimpsed through fog. Her voice echoed not in your ears, but deeper, somewhere in the hollows of your chest, where the blood pulsed slower and the breath seemed to catch. You had seen something in that spring, something not meant to be understood at once. The images returned in pieces. Firelight on armor, wolves in full sprint, the shadowed figure with the blood-red cloak. Each step took you further from her and closer to the camp, but you felt no nearer to answers. The mist was thinner now. Smoke from morning fires hung low, curling around the legs of those already awake. Some sat eating quietly, others stretched and limbered up, greasing blades or binding wrappings around their hands. The atmosphere had changed, no longer uncertain, but focused. Something had shifted after your fight in the circle. Perhaps not fully in your favor, but undeniably in your direction. You passed a group of warriors from the Iron Coast sharing a bowl of broth. One of them nodded at you without rising. Another gave you a two-fingered gesture of warding, not out of disrespect but ritual, a way to greet one touched by old powers. A boy, no older than 12, ran past carrying a bundle of spears on his back. He stopped just short of you, stared for a moment, then darted away, as if realizing he'd come too close to a sleeping bear. You found Alfield by the northern ridge, overseeing the mounting of a small wooden lookout tower. She wore her sword on her back now, and her hair had been freshly braided in the war style, high and tight along the scalp, bound in leather cords. Her expression sharpened when she saw you. "You went," she said. You nodded. Her eyes searched your face. "Did she speak to you?" "She did, and she showed me things." That was all you said. Alfield didn't press. She knew better than to ask for meaning too soon. Some truths, especially those born of prophecy, needed to ferment in silence before they could be swallowed. Instead, she turned and gestured toward the makeshift map laid out on a hide stretched across two crates. "Scouts came down from the West Pass. There's a band of reavers moving toward the coast, fast. Not from any clan we know." You studied the markings. "Southlanders?" She shook her head. "Not clearly. Their weapons are mixed. Some speak our tongue. Some wear charms from the old gods, but others burn trees as they go. They don't move like raiders. They move like hunters." You stared at the map, then beyond it, toward the distant line of hills where mist still clung to the stone. "How many?" 50, maybe more. You narrowed your eyes. "Too many for a simple raid. Not enough for an invasion." She nodded grimly. "They're testing us." "And what do we do?" Alfield's jaw tightened. "We show them they're not welcome." It was decided before the midday sun climbed high. A small warband would ride out to meet the reavers before they reached the lowland farms, not to destroy them, but to scatter them, disrupt their formation, force them to retreat or reveal their intentions. A quick strike meant to be loud, fast, and terrifying. Alfield led the planning, but when it came time to name who would lead the front, all eyes turned to you. You did not speak. You did not ask why. You knew. By dusk, you stood at the head of 15 warriors, some young, eager to prove themselves, others older, heavy with experience. Each one had chosen to follow without being told. Among them was Geir Skalson, his ribs still bandaged, his pride unbroken. "I fight beside those who bled me," he said with a crooked grin. "That's how I know it's worth the price." You nodded once, the closest thing to thanks you could manage. The journey began just after twilight, the mountains turning purple and gold as the sun bled out behind the western ridge. You moved through pine and rock with the silence of wolves. No torches, no banners, only the sound of leather on bark, the occasional creak of armor, and the breath of those who knew battle well. The path took you high, through old tracks once used by fur traders and smugglers. You smelled smoke on the wind long before you saw it. Not the clean smoke of hearth fires. This was heavy, sharp, oak and flesh. Something had already burned. When you crested the final ridge, you saw the source. A small farmhouse lay ruined at the edge of a clearing. Its roof collapsed inward, its animals slaughtered and left untouched. Symbols had been carved into the doorframe, not runes, but crude marks, jagged and circular, like twisted eyes and spirals. A warning, or a signature. You raised your hand, halting the line. Alfield moved up beside you, her face drawn tight. "They're close." You said nothing. Instead, you walked into the clearing, slow and deliberate. The others fanned out behind you, weapons ready but low. The snow here was disturbed. Many boots, some light, others heavy, had passed through in the last few hours. You reached the doorway of the ruined house and crouched beside the markings. Something cold crawled along your spine. It was not fear, it was familiarity. The marks stirred something in the storm behind your eyes. From the trees beyond the clearing came a sudden whistle, short, sharp, then silence. You rose. The reavers emerged not with a charge, but with a calm, terrible certainty. There were more than 50, closer to 80. Their armor was mismatched, faces smeared with ash. Some wore pelts of animals not known to your lands. Others had necklaces made of teeth. A few were bare-chested despite the cold, their skin covered in those same spiraled markings. One of them stepped forward, tall, lean, his eyes ringed with red paint. He held no weapon. His hands were empty. But when he spoke, it was in your tongue. Which of you is Brynjar? Your warriors tensed. Gear shifted his stance. Alfhild's hand hovered near her blade. You stepped forward. I am. The man smiled, wide, too wide. Good, then you remember the fire. He pointed to his own chest, where a brand was barely visible beneath the paint. A spiral, just like those on the door. You burned once, he said softly, and now we burn again. Then, without raising his voice, he turned and walked back into the trees, and the reavers charged. They came with a howl, not like men, but like something older, a sound dragged from the deepest part of the woods, where names were never spoken and fire never touched. 80 bodies surged from the tree line in loose formation, not disordered but wild. Not mindless, but filled with something cruel and ritualistic. They moved with the rhythm of storm tides and avalanche, each step feeding the next in a thunderous crescendo. You did not wait. There was no need for orders. No time. Your body moved before thought, your blood already singing, the iron wind rising behind your ribs. You met them halfway. The first man bore twin axes and a painted face. You struck low, not to kill but to cripple. He fell, his scream cut short by Alfhild's blade as she passed beside you, silent as moonlight. The others followed, scattering into smaller fights, duels, grapples, shouts in the snow. Steel met steel, then flesh, then bone. The clearing became a cauldron of motion and breath and the sharp, wet sound of breaking things. You did not feel the cold. You did not feel the pain, only the rhythm. The berserker's rhythm. Gare fought like a wounded bear, one arm slower than the other, but all the more savage for it. He caught one of the reavers by the throat and threw him into a pine trunk so hard the bark split. Another attacker went for your side with a curved blade, fast and precise. You caught his wrist, twisted, broke it, then drove your elbow into his chest. He crumpled at your feet, but they kept coming. There was no central command, no horn, no calls. The reavers fought in waves, as if something deeper than leadership drove them. A shared hunger, or perhaps a shared madness. Some were silent. Others laughed, a high-pitched, grating sound that turned the stomach. One woman, barefooted and frothing, bit into the neck of a fallen warrior not to kill. He was already dead, but as if feeding. You turned to meet the next one and paused. He had no weapon, just a length of chain wrapped around his fists, and the same spiral brand burned into his chest. His eyes rolled back as he charged. You tried to sidestep. Too slow. He struck you across the shoulder with the chain. You staggered, the bite of metal sudden and real. He came again. 2 quick swings. One grazed your cheek, drawing blood. You let him close. Then you let go. The wind within you howled to life. You felt your breath deepen, your heart slow even as your limbs accelerated. The noise around you faded. There was only him, the chain, the cold, the scent of blood on pine needles. You stepped forward and drove your fist into his gut. He bent forward, wheezing, and you grabbed his head, twisted, brought your knee into his face. He dropped. The wind kept screaming. You turned, another came, then another. The world blurred. You fought as you had trained, not with anger, but with precision honed in silence. Volland had taught you that rage without direction was a storm that destroyed everything, but rage held was a blade. You were the blade now. The tide began to turn. Alfhild led a counter-push with a roar that split the air, her sword gleaming with blood. She moved with purpose, cutting not wildly but with knowledge, each swing a statement, a command. She rallied 2 warriors beside her, and together they drove the enemy back toward the trees. The reavers were losing ground. They felt it too. Some hesitated, eyes darting. The laughter faltered, the shrieking softened. You pressed forward, and then came the whisper. Not a voice, not a sound, a sensation, something just beyond sight. You froze. The others did not notice, but you saw it. Standing just beyond the reach of firelight, half shadowed by the trees, was the same figure you had seen in the seer spring. Tall, cloaked in red, face hidden beneath a hood stitched with bone. He raised one hand, palm outward. The reavers began to retreat, not panicked, not in disarray, but as if called back. They fell away like fog burned off by the sun, slipping between trees with unnatural silence. The ones who could not rise were left behind. The ones who could crawled away, dragging broken limbs and bloodied faces. Within moments, the clearing was quiet. You did not move. Alfhild stood near the tree line, blood on her face, breath ragged. She turned to you. "They're retreating." You said nothing. You stared at the red-cloaked figure, and then he was gone. No sound, no movement. One blink, and the space he had occupied was only mist and pine. You walked toward where he had stood, slowly, cautiously. Behind you, the others tended the wounded, gathered the fallen, lit small fires to warm the bruised. You found nothing. No footprints, no scent, no broken branches. As if he had never been there, only a symbol remained, carved deep into the bark of a tree with something sharper than any blade. The spiral, not just one this time, 3 intertwined. You stared at it for a long time, and behind your heartbeat, behind the wind, behind the distant sound of steel being sheathed, you heard the wolves begin to howl. The howling carried across the trees like a tide that could not be turned back. It wasn't close, not yet, but it was clear and unmistakable. Long, low, answered. A single wolf's call echoed by others, some deep and guttural, some high and distant, a conversation spoken in the tongue of old winters. You stood before the marked tree, the 3 spirals still fresh in the bark. Sap bled slowly from the cuts, glinting like amber in the moonlight. Around you, the warriors had begun tending to their wounded. Some had dropped to one knee in exhaustion, murmuring thanks to gods old and new. Others walked in silence, checking their limbs, their weapons, their thoughts. Alfhild approached from behind. Her steps were quiet, though not for stealth, simply the way of one long used to moving unseen when she wished. "You saw something," she said, not as a question. You nodded. She didn't press. She followed your gaze to the carved symbol. Her brow furrowed. "I've seen it before." You turned to her slowly. She gestured toward the valley. "Years ago, during the last thaw, we chased a band of lowland deserters into the foothills. They'd raided 3 villages in 1 week, burned their own dead, left no survivors. We found a cave where they'd taken shelter, and that symbol was scratched into the stone. Same spiral, same hand, I'd swear it. And they were dead when we arrived," she said. "All of them. Torn to pieces. No signs of battle. No tracks but their own." The wind stirred the branches above. Alfhild's voice lowered. It was as though something found them before we did. You reached out, laid your hand over the spiral. The bark was rough and cold. You could feel the shape beneath your palm, feel the depth of the carving, how deliberately it had been made. Not a symbol of chance, a mark of claiming. Behind you, one of the younger warriors, a boy named Leaf, with a scarred lip and nervous hands, approached. "We've counted the dead," he said. 5 of ours, 7 wounded." "And them?" Alfhild asked. "More than 20, maybe more in the trees, but they left their own behind, no effort to recover bodies." You looked toward the edge of the clearing. One of the reavers lay face down in the snow, his hands still curled around the haft of a shattered axe. His face was pale, lips blue, but his eyes were open, wide, glassy, fixed on something far beyond the stars. You approached the body, knelt. He was young, no older than you had been when you first felt the fury awaken. His chest was bare beneath the tattoos, his skin marked with dozens of small cuts, not from battle, but ritual. You recognized the pattern. Pain not as punishment, but offering. You leaned close. There was something tucked beneath his belt, a scrap of hide, hardened by smoke and marked with ink. You drew it out gently. The ink had faded in places, but you recognized the script. Not from Havengrimmer, not from any clan of the coast. This was older, southern, but twisted. Letters bent into circles, symbols that weren't meant to be read but felt. At the center of the parchment was a single shape, the spiral. You turned it over and saw, written in your own tongue, "We remember the fire." Your breath stilled. The seer's words returned to you in a cold wave. You are not the end of this story, but you may decide where it begins. Alfhild stood nearby, watching. She didn't ask what the parchment said. You handed it to her in silence. She studied it, her jaw tightening. Then, without a word, she tucked it into her satchel and looked to the eastern sky, where the first hints of dawn had begun to gray the clouds. "We need to return," you nodded. The warriors gathered their fallen, built stretchers from pine limbs and cloaks. The air had turned colder, much as if the clearing itself had exhaled some long-held breath. Snow began to fall, soft and silent, covering footprints, blood, and blade alike. You marched at the front. The path back was quiet. No birds sang. No branches creaked. Even the wolves had gone still. By midday, you saw the first smoke of the camp rising ahead. Steady, gray, domestic. A reminder that the world beyond the forest still turned with its own rhythm. When you arrived, word spread quickly. The raiders had been turned. Your band had returned, wounded but victorious. The loss of 5 warriors was mourned, but even in grief there was pride. Not all battles were meant to be survived. Some were meant to be felt. The elders called for a council, but before it gathered, you went to Valand. You found him where you had always known he would be, sitting on a stump near the old shrine stone, carving runes into a length of driftwood with a blade that had no edge. His beard was longer than before, his eyes darker, but he looked up the moment you approached. You saw him, he said. You didn't answer. He nodded as if you had. The red cloak, the mark, the eyes that don't belong to this age. You sat across from him. What is it? You asked. Valand set down the carving. He looked past you, toward the trees. A memory given form, he said at last. A fire that was once extinguished, now breathing again. Not a man. Not anymore. You stared at him. He was one of us? Valand hesitated. Then he said, he was like you. The silence that followed was long and heavy. You spoke only once more before leaving. Is that what I'll become? Valand looked at you, and for the first time you saw something behind his eyes that you had never seen before. Not fear, not sorrow, regret. He said nothing. You rose and left. The council fires were already being lit. The clans had gathered again, but this time the mood was tighter, more guarded. They had seen the mark, they had heard the wolves, and though no one said it aloud, they all felt the same thing. Something was coming, something that remembered and would not forget. The council gathered under the watching pines, just as they had before, but the silence between words was longer now. Not the calm of unity, but the hush of men and women who feared what their tongues might summon if spoken too freely. The clearing that once held the air of a gathering now felt like a burial ground waiting for names. The long stone in the center bore fresh offerings, fish laid over pine boughs, blood dripped from fingers cut in ritual, iron rings placed with care beside antler charms. It was the old way of asking the gods to listen. Not to answer, merely to listen. You stood apart from the others. Not because of pride or command, but because no one stood easily near you now. The fight had changed something. The vision in the woods, the man in the red cloak, the way your name was spoken now, never with scorn, but with weight. Alfhild stood beside the elder woman Sigrun, speaking in low tones. Her hand rested on the hilt of her sword, though not in threat, more in habit, as if ready at any moment to draw it against a truth none of them wished to face. At last, Hrothgar stepped forward. His voice was gravel, worn and steady. We speak now of what we saw, of what we fought, and of what waits in the trees beyond firelight. He looked at you. Brynjar. You nodded once. He did not ask permission. He simply gestured. You stepped into the circle. Every eye turned to you. Some in awe, others in distrust, a few in fear. You felt none of it. The blood of the forest was still in your bones, the howls still faint in your ears. The reavers, you began, were not like those we've known. They didn't come for food or gold or even for sport. They came to mark something, a path, a claim. A murmur spread. You raised the hide scroll taken from the dead reaver's belt and passed it forward. Sigrun took it in her gnarled hands, reading with eyes narrowed. We remember the fire. She repeated it aloud. Fire from what? Someone called. Which fire? You answered. The old fire, the one buried beneath our stories, the rage that was never truly put out, only buried in ash. Silence. Then Alfhild stepped forward. They followed someone. Not a chief, not a jarl, something else, something that moved like a man but carried no breath. Brynjar saw him. So did I. You saw it, the moment the crowd shifted, not backward but inward, shoulders tensed, hands found weapons. One woman muttered a prayer. He wore a red cloak, you said, and the mark, the spiral, threefold. Sigrun nodded slowly. I've seen it, long ago. It was carved into the bones of the drowned washed up during the winter tide. We thought it was a curse from the south. Now I wonder. Hrothgar raised his hand. Whether spirit or man, we must understand this threat, and we must answer it. These reavers will return, but next time, they will not come to test us. They will come to take. Voices rose, a few in agreement, a few in warning. A young Thane from the River clan demanded they fortify their homes. Another wanted to send scouts across the southern valley. But you said nothing. You were watching the flame. The offering fire in the center had begun to burn strangely, the smoke curling downward, the embers flaring blue for a breath, then green. No one else had seen it, only you. And in that moment, something inside you shifted. Not fear, knowing. You stepped back from the circle. Alfield followed. You felt it too, she said. You nodded. Whatever this thing is, she said, it doesn't wait. You walked together in silence, down past the outer tents, past the mead halls and training fields, toward the edge of the high ridge where the wind always blew strongest. There, beneath a crooked pine bent by 100 winters, you stopped. She turned to you. When we were children, she said, you used to chase the fog with a stick and yell at the clouds. Do you remember? You nodded. I thought if I shouted loud enough, the sky would answer. She smiled faintly. Maybe it did. Maybe that's why it's come back for you. You didn't answer, because you knew it had come back for you. The fire, the red cloak, the spiral, all of it. You were not its creator, nor its destroyer. You were its mirror, its echo, and it would not leave you behind. You looked east, where the sky was darkening again. Storm clouds, not of rain, but of something heavier. Behind you, the camp still tried to pretend it was just another day. But here, where the wind whispered, you knew better. Alfield broke the silence. What do we do now? You turned to her, and this time your voice was clear. We go to where the fire began. She blinked. You mean the south? No, you said. You pointed toward the mountains, toward the glacier paths and the forgotten ruins beyond. To the north. She said nothing at first, then nodded, and in that quiet between wind and memory, you both understood. This was not a battle, it was a reckoning. The morning after your decision was colder than any before it. Not by the measure of wind or snow, but by the quiet that settled over the camp. The kind of silence that follows a sentence spoken too clearly. Those who had seen war knew what it meant when warriors prepared to leave not for conquest or raid, but for searching. Searching in the old sense, going where the maps thinned, where memory gave way to myth. You woke before the sun. Alfhild was already waiting, her cloak fastened tight with a wolf-bone pin, her sword wrapped in linen to ward off the mountain frost. She had packed light, dried meat, tinder, a flask of sea oil. At her side was a small pouch of black stones etched with runes. She had not brought them for casting. They were for remembrance. Others joined you by the hour's end. 8 in all. Not chosen, not formally. They simply came. Men and women whose eyes bore the same question yours did. Not what will we fight, but what truth have we forgotten? Geir stood among them, still limping, his ribs bound in thick furs. I fought for blood, he said quietly. Now I'll walk for reason. Life, the scar-lipped boy, held a carved staff longer than he was tall. He said nothing, only touched the spiral symbol painted on the back of his glove. He'd drawn it himself. A woman called Thora arrived with a spear taller than any of you and a hound at her heel. She didn't speak, just stood and waited, eyes always on the sky. You did not speak much before departing. Words had already been spoken, and beyond a certain point, they only hollowed meaning. You left the camp at the second light, when the sun filtered weakly through the first, and frost made lace of every branch. The path north was not a road. It was memory. It began with the old trade trail, long since abandoned, where moss had swallowed the stones and bridges sagged with rot. You moved in silence, the wind breaking only against fur and breath. Crows followed at a distance, not calling, not landing, just watching, like they remembered the shape of this journey. By midday, the pines gave way to ash trees, their trunks white and smooth like bones standing in solemn rows. Here the snow deepened. Here the silence grew more exact. Every boot print stayed crisp for hours, untouched by breeze. There was no sound of squirrel or bird, only the crunch of your steps and the distant crack of ice forming in hidden streams. That night you made camp beneath a crooked stone ledge that jutted from the mountain like a jawbone. Fires were kept low. No stories were told. Alfhild took first watch, her sword across her knees. You dreamt, but it wasn't a dream. You stood in a hall of fire. The walls were made of flame that did not burn. Within them moved shadows, not people, not beasts, but something in between. You heard voices speaking in a tongue you almost knew. Their syllables curled like smoke, and in them you felt hunger, longing, and something older than either. The red-cloaked figure stood at the far end of the hall. He did not move, he did not speak, but the spiral on his chest glowed with pulsing heat. Behind him, the walls split open. You saw the glacier, the mouth of the old world. And then you woke. Alfild was crouched beside you, her breath visible in the dark. "You made a sound," she said, not unkindly, like something trying to remember how to scream. You sat up, heartbeat still stuttering. She handed you a piece of dried meat. "Eat. We leave before dawn." The next day's climb was harder. The trees thinned until there were only stones and bitter wind. The sky pressed closer, heavy with waiting snow. You crossed a rope bridge long fallen into disrepair, each step creaking above the gorge's teeth. By afternoon, the landscape shifted again. A rise of stone curved upward, half swallowed by frost and age. At its peak stood an arch, not made by nature but carved. Symbols traced its edges, weather-worn but not gone. 3 spirals, intertwined. Leaf froze. He whispered, "This is where they crossed." You looked at him. He didn't explain. You stepped forward and passed under the arch. The wind changed. It no longer blew around you but through you, like a breath held for centuries had just been released. On the other side of the arch was a path no map marked, a trail of flat stones still dry beneath the snow, as if they had been waiting, leading not down but inward, into the side of the mountain, toward a cleft so narrow it might be missed if not for the way the light struck it, like a wound in the rock. You followed it, single file. No one spoke. The passage grew darker, colder, but not lifeless. The walls were marked, shallow carvings, not just spirals, but other symbols too. Eyes, teeth, coils. You reached a cavern just wide enough for all of you to stand. At its center, a stone basin filled with ash. Alfild knelt beside it, reached in and withdrew a fragment of bone. It was long, charred black at the edges and carved with runes. Thora leaned close. "That's a name," Gare asked. "Whose?" Alfild read it slowly, lips barely moving. You felt your breath catch. "Your grandfather. Buried here. Burned here. Not in the village. Not in the sea, but in this forgotten mouth of stone." You reached for the basin, fingers trembling, and as your skin touched the ash, warmth shot up your arm. Not heat. Memory. You saw him, Arnvid, standing before the red-cloaked man, kneeling, and the fire behind him roared like a god coming home. The vision did not fade like a dream. It stayed, not only in your sight, but beneath your ribs, behind your teeth, in the marrow of your bones. You could feel the heat of the fire that had roared behind your grandfather, see the way it danced without consuming, the way it moved like breath, alive, aware. Arnvid stood tall, though his shoulders bore the weight of years. He wore no armor, only a fur-lined cloak and the carved bands of a warrior long removed from war. And yet there was no fear in him. Before him, the red-cloaked figure waited, silent. The spirals on his chest pulsed like veins. You could not hear their words, but you saw the exchange, a gesture, a kneeling, a shared look that lasted too long for comfort. Then the fire took him. Not as flame takes a man in death, not screaming, not struggling. The fire received him. His form wavered, dissolved, became smoke, became ash, became something that rose into the cavern's ceiling and vanished. And then the vision ended. You pulled your hand away from the ash in the basin. Your skin smoked, though there was no burn. The tips of your fingers were black with soot, and when you held them up to the dim light, you saw faint lines, spirals too small to have been carved. They had formed there. Alfild watched you with narrowed eyes. "You saw him, didn't you?" You nodded. Thora had gone still. Her hound lay flat on the stone, ears low, tail curled under. Gare muttered, "What in all the gods' names is this place?" You turned slowly, taking in the cavern, the basin, the runes, the silence. "This is where they're made," you said, "where the flame chooses." Alfild frowned. "Made into what?" You walked past her toward the far wall. There, carved deeply into the stone, were a dozen names. Most were unreadable, worn away by time, but you saw one clearly, Arnvid. Beneath it, the spiral. You turned to the others. "He came here before his last battle. He knew what waited. He chose it." Leif's voice was quiet. "Chose what, Brinjar?" You stared at the names, the spirals, the ashes, and for the first time you said it aloud. "To become a vessel." They didn't ask for explanation. They felt it too. The truth didn't need spelling out. It was in the air, in the quiet that clung to your shoulders like a burial shroud. Alfild spoke next. "So this isn't a tomb?" "No," you said. It's a threshold. A gust of wind moved through the cavern, not from the mouth you entered, but from deeper within, a fissure in the wall behind the basin that none of you had noticed before. Cold and dry, but carrying with it the scent of old fire and deep stone. You approached it. The gap was narrow, but wide enough to pass through. You looked back at your companions. I won't ask you to follow. Gare snorted. You don't have to ask. Thora was already at your side, her hound standing again. Alfield met your gaze and said, You didn't ask last time either. So you entered the narrow passage one by one, your torchlight flickering against the stone. The air grew warmer, not hot, but living, as though something breathed in the mountain's chest. You felt it in the soles of your feet. The passage opened into a chamber that had not known light in many lifetimes, and there at the far end stood another figure, not red-cloaked, not moving, a statue. Tall, carved of black stone veined with gold. It wore no crown, held no weapon. Its arms were open, palms upward as though offering or asking, and carved into its chest, spanning shoulder to shoulder, the triple spiral. Below it, more runes. You approached. Alfield lit another torch. The flames flickered along the carvings. Sigrunic script, but older, shaped more like waves than letters. You traced them with your eyes until their meaning began to settle into your thoughts. From fire we came, and to fire we return. But the fire that remembers does not die. It waits, it listens. And when the world forgets itself, it chooses. A silence followed, not empty, but full. Thick with meaning, too old for words. You reached out and touched the statue's hand. Nothing happened at first. Then a low hum like a drum buried under stone. The gold veins glowed faintly. The chamber seemed to breathe. The others stepped back, and you felt the mountain see you, not with eyes, with memory. You saw flashes, warriors roaring in battle, faces lost to time, each one touched by the spiral. Some burned, some victorious, some weeping as they stood alone on smoking fields. Each had come here. Each had passed beneath the gaze of the black statue, and each had been changed. You stepped back, your chest tight. Alfield caught you before you fell. What did it show you? You shook your head. Not what, who. Leif whispered, This is the source. You looked once more at the spirals on the statue's chest, and for the first time you understood. It was not a symbol of power. It was a door, and something was beginning to open it. The humming stopped, but its echo lingered beneath the skin, like the afterglow of a wound not fully healed. You stepped back from the statue, the golden veins now dim and lifeless, the stone face once again silent. But something had changed. Not in the statue, nor in the chamber, in you. The others felt it too. They didn't speak of it. They only watched you as though waiting for a word you had not yet learned to say. Alfield moved first, circling the statue slowly, torch held low. She paused at its back where a new seam had revealed itself, a crack running down the wall, almost invisible in the flicker of flame. But there was no doubt. It had not been there when you entered. Gare ran a hand along the stone. This wasn't open. It was awakened. You approached. The seam, when touched, felt warmer than the rest of the stone. Not hot, but living, like the slow warmth of breath on the nape of the neck. You pressed your palm flat against it. The crack widened. Stone shifted inward with a sound like bones grinding under weight. A hidden door, long sealed, eased open by unseen hands. Beyond it, darkness, cold and thick, a tunnel sloping down into the mountain's belly. No one spoke. You each understood what lay ahead. This was not a hall made by men. This was something else. You descended in silence. The tunnel was smooth, unlike the raw stone above. Not carved, but formed, as though the earth itself had shaped it in stillness. The air was dry, but not dead. Every breath tasted of ash and salt, as if the sea had once passed through and never truly left. Torches cast long shadows across walls that bore no markings. No runes, no sigils, only the occasional ripple in the stone, like the faint impression of something once pressed into it and long since faded. You lost track of time. It may have been hours, it may have been days. And then, without warning, the tunnel opened into a great chamber, and the fire waited. Not flame, not as you knew it, not burning on wood or coal. This fire lived in the air itself. It shimmered across the chamber in golden threads, flickering between pillars like veins of living light. It moved when you moved. It pulsed in rhythm with your heartbeat. The chamber was round, vast, its ceiling lost in shadows. In its center stood a brazier, wide and shallow, filled with embers that did not burn down, that did not flicker, only glowed with steady heat, the kind that lulled rather than consumed. Alfield whispered, "Is this what the seer meant?" You said, "This is where the fire began." Thora and her hound sat silently at the edge of the brazier, her eyes locked on the embers. Leaf dropped to his knees, overcome by something none of you could name. You walked to the fire. The warmth did not sting, it did not demand, it welcomed. You knelt, and the visions came. You saw the first, not the first man perhaps, but the first chosen. He was not large, not scarred, but his eyes held too much for one life. He stood before the fire, as you now did, and laid his hand upon the embers. The flames rose, not in destruction, but in acknowledgement, and they entered him. You saw what he saw, cities forgotten beneath earth, forests that moved of their own accord, beasts that carried voices in their fur. You saw war not for conquest, but for remembrance, battles fought not to win, but to preserve something older than stone. Then you saw others, one by one, the spiral marked them. It gave them fury when needed, silence when demanded. And in their final days, when their bodies could no longer hold the fire, they returned to this place, to give it back. You opened your eyes. Your companions had gathered around the brazier. Their expressions were changed, not afraid, but changed. Alfield stepped forward. Her voice was low. "I think we were never meant to win anything, only to keep something from being lost." You nodded. Gare sat heavily beside you. "So what now? What does it want?" You looked into the embers and answered, "To be carried again." There were no rituals, no chants. You simply reached into the fire. The pain came, not in your skin, but deeper. Your breath vanished, your heart stopped. For a moment, you were not in the chamber, but in 100 other places. On battlefields, in caves, in halls of song, in the arms of those you had lost. Then you breathed in, and the fire entered you. It filled your lungs, your limbs, your memory. You saw everything, not clearly, but as light through water. Faces, names, the paths of your ancestors, the voices of those who had whispered in your blood. When you stood, your hands glowed faintly. The spiral now burned not into skin, but into soul. You turned to the others, and none questioned. They knelt, not in worship, in kinship. They had not been chosen by the fire, but they had chosen you, and the mountain knew it. The chamber pulsed once, then the fire dimmed, and the path behind you began to collapse, not with violence but with purpose, sealing itself, folding back into silence. You had taken what remained. The fire had chosen again, and now the world would feel it stir. You emerged from the mountain just before dusk, when the last breath of daylight touched the peaks in rose and gold. The cold hit you first, not sharp but clean, the way a blade is cleaned before the cut. Snow had fallen in your absence, a thin sheet spread like linen over the stone and moss. It covered your old tracks, erased the signs of your arrival. The others followed in silence. No one spoke of what had happened in the fire chamber. Not yet. It was too fresh, too close to the edge of language. Some things, once touched, need time to settle in the soul before they can be named aloud. Alfield was the last to step out of the pass. She paused at the archway, the spiraled carvings now pale beneath the snow, and ran her hand across the stone. A farewell, a promise. Then she turned and followed you down the path. The descent was slower, not from fatigue, though there was that, but from knowing. You all felt it, the way the air had changed, the way the ground remembered your steps now, the way the crows no longer just watched but followed, not as omens, as witnesses. By the time you reached the tree line, night had taken the sky. The stars were brighter than before, sharper, and in their light, the world felt older, nearer to its bones. You camped near the edge of the ashwood, where the fire could be hidden but still warm enough to keep frost from the hands. Thora's hound curled against her side. Leaf murmured quietly to the runes he carried. Gare stared into the flames, his jaw tight, as if biting down on something he could not yet say. You sat apart. The fire inside you had settled, not as a storm, but as a coiled ember, quiet, steady. You could feel it pulse when you breathed. It did not demand, it simply was. Alfield came and sat beside you, her shoulders wrapped in a deerskin cloak, her hair unbraided now, let loose by wind and time. You carry it well, she said. You didn't respond right away. The fire crackled between you. At last you said, "It's not a burden, but it is a weight." She nodded slowly. "I think that's what it was always meant to be. A long silence followed. Then, more quietly, she asked, "Did it speak to you?" You looked at her. "Not in words." "What then?" You turned your gaze to the trees. "In need." Her brow furrowed. "Need?" You breathed in. The air tasted like frost and pine, but beneath it, beneath all of it, you sensed something more. Like the pressure before a storm. Like something moving far off, but moving toward. "There's something coming," you said. "Something that wants to consume, not for hunger, but for forgetting." Alfield watched you carefully. "You mean the red-cloaked one?" You shook your head. "He's not the threat, he's the echo of one." She frowned, but said no more. Later, when the fire had died to coals, you dreamt again. But this was no vision. This was remembering. You stood at the center of a great hall, but it was not made of wood or stone. It was made of sound, of breath, of heartbeat. Around you sat the spirits of those who had borne the fire before you. They were not solid, but neither were they ghosts. They shimmered with memory. Your grandfather was among them. Arnvid. He looked older now than in your childhood, but his eyes were the same. Sharp, unflinching, full of that wild knowing. He spoke no greeting. He simply stepped forward and placed his hand over your heart. And in that moment, you felt what he had felt. You saw the rise of the red-cloaked man, once a berserker like you, who had been consumed by the fire, not guided by it, who had tried to bend it rather than carry it, who had turned memory into weapon and fury into faith. You saw his fall, not death, for he had not died. He had changed, become something kept alive by those who remembered him wrongly, who whispered his name not in fear, but in worship. And you saw the spiral, not as a symbol of rage, but of return. A cycle. If broken, the fire would scatter, but if carried, it could contain. You woke with the echo of Arnvid's voice still ringing in your chest. Not all fire consumes. Some fire remembers. By morning, the others were already awake, packing in silence, their movements precise and unhurried. They had all seen something in the night, though none spoke of it. When you reached the ridgeline above the camp of Havengrimmer, you saw smoke, not from hearths, from burning. The wind shifted, and you smelled char. You broke into a run. The others followed. By the time you reached the valley floor, the camp lay in ruin. Not razed completely, but marked, tents slashed, fire pits overturned, supply stores emptied or scorched. No bodies, no blood, but symbols carved into wood and stone, smeared in ash and pitch. 3 spirals. You walked through the wreckage, heart quiet, eyes burning. Gare picked up a broken spear, its shaft charred. They didn't come to kill. No, Alfield said, standing by the ruined shrine stone. They came to warn us. You turned in place slowly, the fire in your chest rising, not wild but deliberate. They're coming, you said, and next time they won't leave anyone behind. Thora asked, what do we do? You looked to the mountains, to the fire still flickering in your blood. We gather. You looked at each of them in turn. We bring the clans. We bring the old oaths. We bring those who still remember what it means to carry fire. Life, still pale, asked, and then? You answered without hesitation. Then we burned back. The summons began with smoke. Thora was the first to light the signal fires, a spiral of flame atop the ridge of the Watchers, fed with pine and wolf fat, so the smoke would carry far, thick and black with curling that mimicked the mark they all now knew. From that height, the call spread fast. Within a day, smoke rose from 3 other peaks, the Fang of Hargnir, the Old Teeth at the river fork, and the high cliffs of Fjordsvin. Each fire meant the same thing. Return. It had been generations since the clans had gathered without festival or feud to bind them. Generations since the fire alone had been the reason to move. And yet they came, not all at once and not without caution. But word travels faster than it's given credit for when the wind carries fear. The ruins of Havengrimmer were not rebuilt. They were left as they were, burned, marked, open to the sky. A shrine now, a reminder, a warning. The meeting place became the Stonefield, a wide stretch of land where the grass grows short and the stones rise like broken teeth from the earth. In the days of old, it had been a dueling ground, but now it bore a different weight, not of rivalry, but reckoning. Alfield stood at your side as the first of the clans arrived. The Seawalkers from the Western Isles came in black ships, their prows carved into krakens and seal-eyed women. They brought spears of driftwood tipped with shark's tooth and a song that made the wolves in the valley fall silent. The hill tenders of the south came cloaked in moss and brown wool. their faces painted in earthen tones, their eyes mistrustful but wide. They carried axes older than memory and charms carved from antler and root. The sky-fletched came down from the high snows, longbows strung across their backs, white braids trailing behind them like comet tails. They moved with the stillness of glaciers and spoke only when needed. More followed. You greeted them not as a jarl, not as a chieftain, but as the bearer of the fire. They saw the spiral burned faintly into your chest, pulsing with memory, and they bowed not in submission, but in acknowledgement. Each camp lit their fires in the shape of the mark. Each warrior brought a piece of the old world, a name, a weapon, a truth. And slowly, the Stonefield became something else. A place of convergence, a place where remembrance could become resistance. You spoke to them on the fourth night, when all had arrived and the moons hung like twin eyes above the mountain rim. You stood upon a stone mound once used for burial, now ringed in flame. The gathered clans watched in silence, hundreds of them, faces from every corner of the known lands, some young, barely into their first blood, others gray-bearded, faces lined by years and storms, all waiting. You spoke not with fire but with steadiness. They've returned, your voice carried in the cold air, not to conquer but to erase. The wind stirred. They moved not for land or gold, they moved to silence what we are, to unwrite what was carried. You lifted your hand. They come with the spiral turned inward, not as a path but as a trap. They twist what once kept us, now they use it to bind. You step down from the stone. They call themselves nothing now. They wear no clan name. They burn their dead and mark the ash with lies. They are not just men. A murmur passed through the crowd. They are vessels emptied of meaning, filled with hunger. You reach the center of the ring. I carry the fire, but not alone. It is not mine. It is ours. You knelt, not in submission, in offering. To any here who remember the oaths beneath the stars, to any who have felt the wolves follow, to any whose bones have heard the whisper of flame, you are already chosen. One by one they knelt, a wave of knees on earth, the sound of armor bending, the creak of leather and breath. The spiral was not a mark anymore, it was a return. That night a great feast was lit, not of celebration but of readiness. Meat roasted over open flame, mead passed in silence, stories told not for laughter but for memory. The young learned names long buried, the old remembered oaths they had not spoken since youth. You sat with Alfhild at the edge of the field. She watched the flames, her eyes reflecting them like mirrors. You did not speak like a man, she said quietly. You looked at her. She did not smile. She did not frown. You spoke like a fire speaks. A pause, clear, unstoppable. You said nothing. The fire pulsed within you still, not brighter but deeper. From beyond the circle, scouts returned. One knelt before you, breath sharp with frost. They're moving. You stood. How many? Too many to count. But they don't march like armies. They spread, like ink in water. You looked to the mountains. The red-cloaked figure waited there, not in hiding, in welcome. He wanted you to come, and now you would. The march began beneath gray skies and a hollow moon, neither full nor new, as if even the heavens had chosen to hold their breath. The Stonefield was left behind with no banner raised, no cairn to mark the place. It did not need one. Those who had gathered would remember. They would carry the memory in their scars, in their songs, in the burn of ash that now smudged each warrior's brow. You led them north, not in a parade, not in lines, but like a tide rising over scattered stone. The clans moved in waves, each at their own pace, but always forward. The sea walkers brought sleds fitted with curved blades to carry supplies over ice. The skyfletch scouted from the peaks, moving in silence with arrows already notched. The hill tenders whispered to the forest, reading signs in bent grass and claw marks on bark. Each brought their oldest, each brought their fiercest. Even the young came, not out of hunger for glory, but out of knowing. They had seen what had become of Havengrimmer. They had read the spiral burned into the stones. Alfhild rode beside you, wrapped in her crimson cloak, the same one her mother had worn into the siege of Ulgard many winters ago. Her sword now bore a line of black along the blade, not paint, but fire-tempered steel, reforged after the mountain. The smith had said it would hold, even against what did not bleed. Gare walked at your flank, one arm still bound tight beneath his cloak, the other carrying a war pick older than most men alive. Thora and her hound patrolled the edges, saying little, their eyes always cast toward the trees. For 6 days you marched. The forest thinned, the snow deepened, each night brought colder winds, and with them, unease. You were being watched. No one said it, but every fire burned a little smaller. Every meal was eaten without conversation. The laughter, once soft and shared, vanished. Scouts returned with no signs of movement, yet always with the same look in their eyes, tight, wary, alert. On the 7th night, the mist came. It did not rise from the ground, but spilled from the trees like breath from a wound. It swallowed sound. It dulled the stars. And somewhere within it, you heard the whispers. Not in words, in memory. You sat alone near your fire, the others asleep or pretending to be. The flames cast faint shadows on the frost-covered stones. And then, without movement, without sound, you felt it. A presence. You looked up. He stood across the fire, red cloak, spiral chest, bare feet pressing no prints into the snow. The fire did not flicker. The mist did not move, but the figure remained unmoving, watching. You rose. He raised a hand, not in threat, not in peace. An invitation. You have brought them. His voice was not loud, but you felt it in your bones. You said nothing. They will not save you. Still, you did not answer. They follow you, but they do not carry it. Not as you do. You stepped forward, firelight warming your shoulders. And what do you carry? You asked. He tilted his head. I carry what was left. A long silence passed. Then he said, I remember the fire before it chose balance, before it feared what it could become. You narrowed your eyes. You turned it into hunger. He smiled, slowly, like a wound stretching open. I freed it. Around you the mist thickened. Shapes moved in its depths. Figures not fully formed. Spirals glowed faintly in the distance. He turned to go, but paused. You will see it soon, he said. The source, the heart of what we were, and then you will choose. You asked, what choice? He looked back over his shoulder, to carry or to consume. Then he vanished. The mist dissolved like snow on warm skin. The fire flared once, then steadied. You were alone again. But the silence had changed. In the morning, Alfield found you staring into the embers. She didn't ask. She didn't need to. You simply said, we go east. She nodded, and the clans turned. The land changed. Where once there had been forest, now stood stone, jagged and dry, as if the earth itself had been wounded and left to scar. Pools of still water marked the way, untouched by wind, reflecting skies that did not match your own. The animals disappeared. The birds no longer called. Even the air tasted different. And then one night the scouts returned with word, a ruin, built into the mountain's spine. Its towers long collapsed, its gates buried in stone, but its heart still breathing smoke. The fire's source, not a forge, not a shrine, but something older. A vault where the first flame was kept and where the spiral had once turned outward to guide. Now it had turned inward to trap. The ruin rose from the mountain like a ribcage unearthed, broken, blackened, bent inward. The remnants of what had once been a fortress or temple now resembled a mouth yawning wide, half swallowed by centuries of snow and silence. Vines of dead iron clung to the stone, twisted and rusted, and spirals were etched into every visible surface. Not carved with care, but scratched, layered atop one another in a frenzy of repetition. You stood before its threshold with the wind at your back and the weight of every step you'd taken pressing into your shoulders. The others fanned out behind you, silent, reverent, wary. There was no discussion, no command. Everyone knew what this was, the vault, the heart of it. And what waited inside was not a battle, it was a reckoning. Alfield stepped to your side, eyes narrowed at the ruin's maw. This place, it listens. Gare grunted from somewhere behind. It watches too. I've felt it since we crossed into this valley. Even Thora's hound had stopped, refusing to take another step closer, its ears low and teeth bared at something unseen. The beast had not flinched during storms or battle, but now it trembled. Life whispered, this isn't just stone. He was right. You moved first. The entry hall was dark, yet not in total shadow. Something glowed faintly from within, an amber pulse, slow and steady, like the beat of a sleeping heart. The air was thick, not with dust, but with memory. You could taste it, iron, smoke, and sorrow. You passed beneath the archway. The spiral greeted you, carved into the lintel above, deeper than any chisel could have etched. It had been made with heat, with rage, with intention. Inside, the ruin opened into a vast chamber, once a sanctuary, now a skeleton. Broken statues lined the walls, faceless, their features melted by some long-ago heat. The stone tiles were cracked in patterns that mirrored flame, and in the center lay a pool of blackened ash, surrounded by a ring of bones. Alfield knelt near the edge. They were not buried, she murmured. They offered themselves. You stepped to the center. The fire inside you flickered, not with fear, with recognition. This was the origin. This was where the spiral had first been drawn, not as a curse, but as a vow, and something had twisted it. There was no voice, no shadow, no figure in red, only the silence, but it was a silence filled with waiting. You raised your hand and pressed your palm to the stone altar in the center. It was warm, and then without sound, the chamber shifted. The bones around you quivered. The ash pulsed, and you were elsewhere. Not your body, but your memory. You stood in the same chamber, but whole, alive, lit with golden flame and filled with song. Dozens stood around the altar, warriors and weavers, seers and smiths, all bearing the spiral openly on their skin, painted in oils and blood and joy. They chanted not for war, but for balance. The fire they tended was not to destroy, it was to remember. Every name spoken, every tale preserved, every scream born in grief, the spiral turned outward, carrying memory back into the world. But then, the fire faltered. You saw him again. The man in the red cloak, though he had no cloak then, only eyes full of bitterness and a spiral freshly carved into his chest. He stepped forward when others stepped back. He demanded the fire obey. He wanted it to burn louder, brighter, hotter. He didn't want to carry it, he wanted to wield it. The fire recoiled, but he was already inside it, and when it rejected him, it did not extinguish him. It split. Part of the flame was lost, not gone, twisted, turned inward. The spiral became a lock, and the ruin, this vault, became the key. You gasped and fell back into yourself. The chamber was still, but now you understood. They sealed it, you said aloud. The old bearers, they locked away the broken flame. Alfield helped you steady, and he's come to break it open. You turned to her. He doesn't want the fire we carry. He wants what was cast out. Gare stepped forward. So what do we do? You looked once more at the altar, now pulsing faster like a heartbeat stirred awake. We stop him. And then a voice echoed from the shadows above. You are too late. The red-cloaked figure descended the stairs at the far end of the ruin, flanked by others, not reavers, not warriors, but vessels like him, marked, hollowed, faces hidden beneath veils, each bearing the triple spiral burned into their flesh. He stepped to the edge of the altar ring, his eyes fixed on you. I gave it time, he said softly. I invited you. I wanted you here. Because when the vault opens, I want you to see what your ancestors buried. You stepped forward. I've seen it. Then you know, he said. It is purer than your fire. It has no memory, no hesitation, no sorrow. It does not carry. It consumes, as it was meant to. Alfield drew her sword. And what will you do with it? He looked at her, and something like pity passed through his gaze. I will become it. Then the altar split down the center with a sound like stone breaking across time. And from beneath the ruin, a light began to rise, not gold, not red, but black, burning. The black flame rose without heat. It did not crackle or hiss. It made no sound at all. It climbed from the broken altar like ink spilled into water, weightless, fluid, and terrifying in its stillness. Where it touched stone, the stone did not scorch. It forgot. Runes faded, spirals unraveled, bone turned to dust. The red-cloaked man stepped into its glow. He did not burn. He shone. His eyes, once filled with fire, now held nothing. Not rage, not joy, only absence. The kind of void that does not hunger, but devours because it exists. The black flame coiled around him like a crown, like armor, like roots climbing a corpse. Alfield moved first. She hurled a spear, swift, clean, unerring. The moment it passed through the flame, it vanished. Not shattered, not deflected, erased. You felt the fire inside you recoil. It did not fear, it remembered. This was the flame it had been severed from, the part cast away, sealed beneath stone and story. The spiral turned inward, and now it lived again. The cloaked man turned his gaze to you. You see it, he said, his voice no louder than a whisper. You said nothing. It is not evil, he continued. It is truth. Memory is weight. Memory is war, but forgetting is peace. I offer them silence. Around him, the veiled figure stood unmoving. Not warriors, not priests, vessels. You do not carry the flame, you said. You flee it. He tilted his head. I carry its final shape, the one freed of burden. It burned before. Now it cleanses. Thora's hound began to growl, low and steady. Gare gripped his war pick, teeth clenched. Enough talk. The chamber shuddered. The altar cracked further. The black flame spread in veins along the floor, reaching like fingers toward the bones, the statues, the ancient scripts, and then toward you. Alfield stepped in front of you. We stand. You felt the fire inside you surge, not in defense, but in declaration. It rose through your chest, filled your throat, pressed against your spine. It remembered names, it remembered faces, it remembered why it had been made. Not to consume, to keep. You stepped past Alfield and walked toward the black flame. It hesitated. The cloaked man frowned. He whispered, "You carry it well, but not long enough." He raised his hand. The flame surged. It rushed toward you, a tidal wave of unmaking. Black fire bearing no heat, only oblivion. You raised your hand and answered. Your flame met his, gold to black, memory to void. Where they touched, the world tore, not apart, but into two truths. The chamber faded, and suddenly you stood in a place that was not place. Above you, stars that did not move. Below, no ground, only echoes. Before you, the red-cloaked figure stripped of form, no longer a man, a shape made of the spiral itself, turning inward and inward again. He spoke, but not with sound. Let go. You felt it then, the temptation, the ease. To forget every wound, every loss, every scream that had marked your past. To empty yourself, to float. But the fire in your chest held you. It whispered names. Your mother, singing lullabies in the storm. Volland, teaching you stillness on the cliffs. The first man you ever felled in battle, his eyes not angry, only tired. Alfield, kneeling by your side, not asking, only knowing. The fire did not demand, it reminded. And you chose. You stepped forward, and you spoke. I remember. The golden flame blazed from your chest, not outward, but through the spiral, cracking it from within. The cloaked figure staggered. You reached for him, not to strike, but to touch. And when your hand found his shoulder, the black flame buckled. Because memory is heavier than silence. He screamed, a sound not of pain, but of everything he had fled. And in that scream the chamber returned. Stone, fire, blood. He fell to one knee, the black flame unraveling around him like smoke through a broken door. The vessels trembled. One by one their veils slipped, eyes returned, tears fell. They had been asleep, and now they remembered. The spiral cracked, the altar collapsed, and the ruin began to tremble. Alfield caught you as you stumbled. Your voice was hoarse. We have to go. Gare called out. The mountain's giving way. The stone ceiling split above. You ran, not from fear, but from knowing your task here was done. The fire would not be sealed again. It had chosen, and now it would be carried. You ran beneath falling stone and ancient echoes. The ruin groaned around you, a beast dying slow, its bones collapsing into themselves. Dust thickened the air, and the last flickers of the black flame vanished into cracks in the altar. Where the spiral once burned into the stone, only fractures remained, a memory unraveled but not forgotten. Your boots struck shattered tiles. Ash rose with every step. Behind you, the others followed. Alfield's hand never once leaving your shoulder, guiding when your vision blurred. Gare cleared debris with raw strength, his war pick now blackened at the edges, yet still whole. Thora's hound barked once, sharp and clear, guiding the way through a collapsing arch. You emerged into the cold with breath burning your throat. The mountain let out one final groan behind you, not an explosion, not a roar, a sigh, like something immense had exhaled its last breath. Then silence, and snow. It began to fall in fine flakes, soft and steady, untouched by wind, as if the mountain, now hollowed of its burden, had finally been allowed to sleep. You stood on the ridge, staring back at the ruin, its entrance now buried under tons of earth and stone. Nothing remained of the black flame, not to the eye, but you felt its weight, still lingering beneath your ribs, not inside you, but near, like the shadow of a wound not yet scarred. Alfield was the first to speak. He's gone. You didn't answer, because he wasn't. Not truly. The red-cloaked man, the one who had once carried the fire and turned from it, had been broken, unmade, but some part of him still lived in the silence he left behind, in the temptation to forget, in the pull you felt even now, the whisper that tried to undo the pain of memory. But the fire you carried was louder, and it burned steady. You turned to the others. Leaf was on his knees, hands in the snow, weeping without sound. His runes had scattered from his satchel during the escape, now lying around him like stars fallen from the sky. Thora stood beside her hound, her face unreadable. She was watching the tree line, where something had shifted. Not a threat, not a movement, but a change in the listening of the woods. Gare stood with blood on his cheek, one eye swollen, but smiling faintly. "I thought we'd die in there," he said. "But now, I don't know what this is." You said, "It's beginning." He blinked. "What is?" You looked to the horizon, where distant smoke rose, where echoes of drums you did not know beat faintly across the ice. "This was not the end of the flame," you said, "only the end of its silence." Alfhild drew her cloak tighter. "And what do we tell them? The ones who stayed behind, the ones who followed us here?" You thought for a long moment. Then you said, "We tell them the fire remembers. We tell them the spiral has turned outward again." And you began the walk down from the mountain. The others followed. The valley below had changed. You saw it first in the trees, bark split with new growth, branches holding small buds despite the frost. The animals had returned, distant shapes flickering between trunks. A stream, once frozen, now ran beneath a skin of mist. But it was not spring. This was not the return of warmth. It was the return of balance, where fire and memory moved together again. You returned to the stone field 7 days later. The clans had not scattered. They had waited. Fires still burned, and stories had been told in your absence about what had happened, about what it had meant. No one knew the whole truth, but they knew enough that something had been carried into the dark and something had come back out. When you arrived, they gathered without needing to be called. Alfhild stood beside you once more. You raised no weapon. You bore no crown. Only the spiral burned faintly upon your chest, no longer glowing, but present. You stepped forward, and without fanfare, you spoke. "It is done." The murmurs died, but the fire remains, and it must move. They listened, not just through me, through you, through all who remember, through all who carry. You looked to the young, the children near the edge of the crowd, watching with wide eyes. "We do not carry flame for power," you said. "We carry it because forgetting is easier than remembering, and we choose to remember." The wind shifted, and you added, "We carry it so that others do not have to burn alone." And then you knelt, and so did they. The entire field bowed, not in submission, not in worship, but in recognition that the fire was theirs. And from that moment it spread, not in destruction, but in memory. The spiral turned again, outward, alive. The snow melted slowly that spring. It lingered along the edges of the fields, clinging to shaded stones and hollows as though reluctant to leave. The river swelled with runoff, gray and cold, carving new paths across the valleys. And in the stillness between frost and thaw, something deeper shifted, not in the land, but in the people. Those who had followed you to the vault did not speak of it in full, not because they wished to forget, but because some truths, once carried, lived better in silence. They did not share what the black flame had said, or how the ruin had pulsed with unmaking. They spoke only of the spiral turning outward again, and the choice it had offered. More gathered in the weeks that followed, not warriors, not always. Farmers, craftsmen, midwives, and sailors. People who had heard the tale of a fire not for destruction but for remembrance, of a bearer who knelt instead of ruling, of a path not made for kings but for those willing to carry what others left behind. And slowly, without decree or ritual, the field became a place. No banners were raised, no walls built, but fires were lit, stories told, names remembered. And the flame, that quiet, pulsing ember first lit in a forgotten age, now passed from voice to voice, from hand to hand. Some carved spirals into stone, others painted them on their doors. Children etched them into snow with sticks, not knowing why it felt right. You stayed, not in the center, but along the edge where the hills rose and the trees leaned in. You built a longhouse from pine and stone, with a hearth that never cooled and a roof shaped like the mouth of a cave. Those who visited didn't knock. They sat, they waited. And when they spoke, it was of grief, of a memory of the weight they could no longer carry alone. You never turned them away. Alfhild stayed too, though she would vanish for weeks at a time, returning with weathered boots and stories of old clan sites reawakened, of forges lit again, of forgotten oaths being whispered back into the wind. She never said where she went. You never asked. Gare became a teacher of sorts, not of words, but of movement. He showed young warriors how to fight with purpose, not rage, how to bleed without breaking. He laughed more now. Sometimes he laughed alone, Thora returned to the forest. She did not speak often, but when she did, her voice was clear, like water over stone. Her hound grew old beside her. They both walked slower, but never weaker. Leaf carved, always carving. The runes on his staff became a spiral of their own, not one that turned inward, but a winding path of names. He no longer shook when he worked. The days passed like leaves downriver, quietly, unnoticed except by those who watched closely. And then one evening, as dusk spilled gold across the field, a rider arrived. Young, barely grown, dust on his cloak, soot on his hands. He bore no weapon, only a scrap of cloth, red, frayed, and scorched. You met him at the edge of the firelight. He bowed, not deeply, but with the reverence of someone who had run a long way to carry something that could not be left behind. "They're stirring again," he said. "Not like before, quieter, hidden." You took the cloth in silence. It was not fresh, but it was recent. The spiral burned into its fabric was imperfect, uneven, as though drawn by someone who had only heard of it, not seen it, a counterfeit memory. "They call it the hollow flame," the boy added. "They say it burns clean, no pain, no grief, only silence." Your hand clenched around the cloth. Behind you the fire pulsed, and the wind shifted, not in threat, in recognition. You turned to the boy. "Thank you." He looked uncertain. "What should I do now?" You looked past him, toward the hills where the old roads vanished into mist and pine. "Rest," you said. "And when you wake, tell your story." He blinked. "To who?" "To whoever will listen." And you walked away. Alfield waited at the longhouse, leaning on the frame. She saw the cloth, and she didn't ask. She only said, "So it begins again." You nodded. "No," you said quietly. "It continues." And you stepped inside. You did not pack. You did not sharpen your blade. You lit the fire and sat, because the flame does not chase. It waits, and it remembers. That spring, the field blossomed with more than snowmelt. Stories like sap rose through the bones of the land. Some were whispered over embers, others sung in full voice from the tops of hillocks. But none were idle. Every tale carried weight, because every voice now understood that what was told shaped what would return. And though the black flame had been sealed, though the spiral had turned outward once more, the world beyond the valley did not quiet. It only paused. The riders came first, one by one at first, then in twos and threes, cloaked in smoke, dust, and rumor. They brought no sigils. Their weapons were crude, half-rusted, and their stories stranger still. In the lowlands, they said, fires were burning without fuel. Spirals were appearing on skin without paint. Entire hamlets had vanished, not razed, but unmarked, gone from stone, story, and name alike. And always they spoke of a symbol, a spiral, but not yours, not outward, not carrying, inward. Always inward. You listened. You did not rush to act, because haste is the child of fear, and fire that leaps too fast becomes smoke and ruin. Instead, you walked the fields in the morning, where dew clung to blades of grass like silvered breath. You spoke with the old ones who remembered the first songs. You watched the children draw spirals in the dirt and teach each other which way it turned. And you waited. One night, beneath the crescent moon, Alfield came to your longhouse with her sword unbuckled but close. She leaned against the doorpost and looked at you without speaking. At last you asked, "Where?" She said, "The Stone Coast." That was far, farther than any clan had ranged in 2 generations. A place of cliffs and shipwrecks where the sea clawed the land back with each storm. It had once been home to a line of salt-born folk who listened more to the tide than to kings, but they had faded long ago. Now it stirred. She added, "Their fires do not give light." You nodded. And the next morning, you walked again. This time not alone. Word spread faster than you moved. Before you reached the edge of the first ridge, 30 had joined you. By the third day, nearly 60. Some bore weapons. Some bore only stories, but all bore the spiral, painted, carved, or carried within. The journey was hard. The rivers ran colder than expected, and one night, frost returned without warning its love, killing half the food in a single breath. But no one turned back, not because of loyalty to you, but to what they remembered. By the time the Stone Coast came into view, jagged cliffs rising like broken teeth from the foam, the sky had turned gray, and the wind carried a scent that did not belong to sea or storm. Ash. You made camp on the edge of an old fort, now crumbled to foundations. The bones of it still spoke. Here, a doorway, there the hearth. Beneath a fallen lintel, you found a fragment of a spiral, weathered nearly smooth. Someone had once carried fire here, long ago. Alfhild studied it in silence. Then she said, "They're near." You felt it too, not in sound or sight, but in stillness. The birds did not cry. The sea no longer crashed. Even the wind pulled back. That night, you sat before a low fire, its lightened behind stones to avoid drawing too much attention. Life sat across from you, left hands trembling as he worked a carving from driftwood. His eyes kept flicking to the cliffs. He said softly, "They're trying to unmake it, the spiral, the shape itself." You looked at him. He held up the wood. It showed a spiral carved carefully, not smooth but alive, as if each turn remembered the last. He handed it to you. "Even a story needs a shape," he said. "Take away the curve, and it's just a line. A line goes nowhere." You held it for a long time. Then you said, "They won't erase it," and stood, your breath clouded in the salt cold air. Alfhild rose beside you, her cloak snapping in the wind. Thora joined, Geir too, faces familiar and new, all waiting. You pointed to the cliffs. "They're building something there," you said. "A new spiral, one that turns inward." They watched you in silence. "Not with stone," you added, "with belief." A pause. Then you said, "We carry the fire because it remembers, because it shapes, because it binds. We don't stop them by killing. We stop them by remembering what they want us to forget." And you turned toward the cliffs, toward the hollow light, not to destroy, but to reclaim. You reached the cliffs at dawn. The sea below roared with the voice of 1,000 winters, hurling itself against stone that had stood since before names were carved. The sun was a pale smear behind the clouds, casting no warmth, only a dull silver glow over the jagged edge of the world. And there, perched on a promontory that jutted like a dagger into the tide, was what they had built. It was not a temple. It was not a fortress. It was a circle, low, dark stones arranged in a perfect spiral, set into the ground so that the shape could not be seen except from above. Its turns were sharp, each curve precise, unnatural. At its center, a single figure stood, cloaked not in red but in gray, so deep it seemed to swallow color. You knew him, not by name, but by absence. He had no fire, not black, not gold, nothing. He turned as you approached, your group moving like a storm without sound. Behind him, the others gathered, men and women whose faces were empty of fear, of joy, of memory. Their skin was marked not with paint or ash, but with scars etched in exact spirals. Their eyes did not blink, their mouths did not move, they had emptied themselves. And in the silence he spoke. "You should not have come." You stepped forward. "You've built a wound," you said, and called it peace. He did not respond. Alfhild stood at your side. She drew her blade but did not raise it. "Tell them what this place is," you said. He looked past you to the sea. "Then this is the unbinding, the spiral to return to what it was before fire, before burden, before memory." You took another step. "It's not peace if nothing remains." He turned to face you fully. His eyes were deep, not in wisdom, but in absence. Not empty, just gone. "Nothing must remain," he said. "Only then can we stop the burning." The people behind him did not move. They were the echo of his belief. Their silence was not reverence. It was the void he carried. And you understood then that this was not a man who hated the fire. He had once carried it, and it had broken him. You said you don't want to forget. You want to be forgotten. He flinched, only slightly, but enough. And you stepped into the spiral. The others followed, slowly with care. Not to fight, but to carry. You walked the outer ring first, your boots pressing into the ash-lined path. As you moved, your fire stirred. Not violently, gently, like a hand resting on your shoulder. Each step remembered. The man watched in silence. You began to speak, not a speech, not a challenge, a name. Then another, and another. Names of the lost, names of the remembered, names of those who had carried fire and fallen before the spiral could be turned again. The air shifted. The sea fell quiet. Your voice did not rise, it only carried. And the flame within you burned steady, quiet, golden. The gray-robed man took a step back, then another. His followers did not move, but their eyes wavered. One dropped to her knees. Another reached for something, a thread of memory, a face, a feeling. And the spiral began to break, not in fire, in remembrance. You reached the center. You stopped and knelt, not to him, to all fire, to what must be carried. And the spiral cracked beneath your knees. The stones split, not with sound, but with release. The tension that had held them, that had bound their path inward, dissolved like breath in frost. The gray-robed man fell to the ground, trembling. Tears, not of grief, not of rage, fell from his eyes, of return. And slowly, the others followed. The spiral was no longer a trap, it was a path again, outward. You stayed until the tide rose and touched the stones. Then you turned and walked away. Alf Hill beside you. No one spoke, because there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to fight, only to remember. And in the seasons that followed, the fire spread. Not in conquest, but in light. The spiral appeared again, not on banners, but in doorways, in embroidery, in song. Not to command, to remind that peace is not the absence of pain, is the presence of those willing to carry it. And when the last light of that age dimmed, when your own fire flickered low, they said you walked into the snow without a cloak, the spiral faint on your back. And they said the wind did not howl that night. It whispered your name and all the names you carried.